ABC General Hospital spoilers for Monday, March 30 reveal that a single gunshot can split a city in half, but in Port Charles, the real devastation never comes from the bullet alone. It comes from the silence afterward, from the suspicious glance that lasts a second too long, from the father who suddenly looks at his son like a stranger, from the woman who realizes rescue and revenge have started to feel dangerously similar, from the grieving lover who refuses to believe the easiest answer because grief has sharpened his instincts into something almost savage. And as fear spreads through familiar streets, old loyalties begin to rot from the inside. What looked like one violent crime starts exposing a chain of private wars, hidden agendas, and emotional fractures that have been building for far too long. This is not just a season of loss for Port Charles. This is the season in which trust turns toxic, grief becomes strategy, and the people who still believe they are protecting their families may end up destroying them with their own hands. Dante had spent years convincing himself that he understood the difference between danger in the streets and danger inside a family, but what was happening with Rocco was dismantling that belief piece by piece. At first it had seemed like ordinary tension, the kind that grows quietly in young people who are trying too hard to appear unaffected by the chaos around them. Rocco had become guarded, too controlled in some moments and too volatile in others. He was making choices that felt calculated but emotionally disconnected, moving through the house with the kind of distracted caution that made Dante's instincts flare. It was not just rebellion. It was not ordinary secrecy. It was something more disturbing, something that suggested Rocco knew more than he should about the shooting of Cullum, and worse, that he might somehow be tied to it in ways Dante could not yet fully prove. That suspicion poisoned everything. Every silence became evidence. Every evasive answer felt like a lie. Every glance away looked like guilt. The tragedy was not only that Dante was beginning to suspect his own son. The tragedy was that part of him hated himself for how quickly suspicion was overtaking compassion, and yet he could not stop. His life had trained him to read patterns, to see what others missed, to understand that the people closest to a crime were often the ones least expected. But fatherhood demanded something else. It demanded patience, mercy, and the willingness to believe in innocence even when the facts began to darken. Dante found himself failing at that balance. The more he watched Rocco, the more his fear mutated into anger. That anger burst out in ways neither of them could take back. Dante pressed too hard, questioned too aggressively, and turned concern into accusation. What should have been an attempt to reach his son became an emotional assault. A collision between a man wearing the instincts of a detective and the panic of a father terrified that he had missed some fatal warning sign. For Rocco, the damage ran even deeper because Dante's suspicion did not land as protection, it landed as betrayal. Whatever secret Rocco was carrying, whether it was direct involvement, dangerous knowledge, or merely the burden of having witnessed more than anyone realized, Dante's attacks shoved him further into isolation. Rocco began to harden in response, not because he no longer cared, but because hurt was transforming into defiance. The more Dante pushed, the more Rocco began to look at him as just another authority figure determined to control him rather than understand him. Their relationship started changing in terrifying ways. What had once been rooted in imperfect but genuine love now felt like a battlefield where every emotional exchange carried the threat of permanent damage. Dante thought pressure might force the truth into the open. Instead, it deepened the divide and made Rocco more vulnerable to outside influence, precisely at a moment when manipulation could become deadly. While Dante was tearing his home apart, trying to get ahead of the truth, Britt was operating inside a different kind of storm, one where action mattered more than hesitation, and where every second Jason remained trapped felt like a personal failure she refused to accept. The confirmation of Cullum's crimes did not calm the situation the way some had expected. It made everything more dangerous. Confirmation meant structure. It meant hierarchy. It meant that what had once looked like scattered brutality was now undeniably part of a larger machine with rules, leverage, and backup plans. Britt understood that immediately, perhaps more clearly than anyone else, and that understanding changed her. She no longer believed Jason could be saved through simple improvisation or emotional appeals. If she wanted him alive, she would need to seize control of a situation built by ruthless minds who thrived on confusion and fear. That need for control became Britt's greatest strength and her most dangerous weakness. She told herself that her determination was about Jason, about pulling him out before the walls closed in for good, but beneath that was something darker and more personal. Britt was exhausted by powerlessness. Too many times in her life she had been forced to react, to adapt, to survive on someone else's terms. This time she wanted to dictate the terms herself. She wanted to outmaneuver the men who thought violence made them untouchable. She wanted to take the terror that had been inflicted on Jason and weaponize it against the people responsible. Rescue, for Britt, was becoming inseparable from domination. She was not just trying to save a man she cared about. She was building a strategy to take command of the entire board. That transformation made her frighteningly effective. She began moving through Port Charles with cold precision, gathering fragments of information, testing loyalties, and reading weakness in places others ignored. She understood that Cullum's confirmed criminal footprint would cause panic among his allies, and panic always created openings. Britt started using those openings with almost surgical ruthlessness. She pushed on old pressure points, reignited quiet resentments, and manipulated fear into cooperation. But every step deeper into that world carried a cost. The more she embraced control, the more she risked becoming emotionally unrecognizable even to herself. Her love for Jason remained real, but it was now fused with vengeance, pride, and a growing taste for strategic power. Saving him might require her to become the kind of person Jason himself would find deeply troubling, and somewhere inside that contradiction, Britt could feel the ground shifting beneath her. As Port Charles reeled from the growing violence, Marco's death detonated across the city like an emotional aftershock no one had prepared for. There are deaths that create sadness, and there are deaths that expose fault lines. Marco's death did the latter. It forced every conversation into a more dangerous place because it was impossible to separate grief from blame. People wanted a clear villain. They wanted a name that would make the pain easier to carry. Sonny was the obvious target for suspicion, the convenient answer in a city accustomed to tracing bloodshed back to him. But Lucas could not accept that explanation, not because he was naive, but because grief had sharpened him into someone far less willing to settle for appearances. He knew what easy narratives looked like, and this felt too easy. Lucas's pain was raw enough to ruin him, but instead it gave him focus. The loss of Marco hollowed him out and filled that emptiness with purpose. Every memory now came with an edge. Every reminder of what had been taken from him became fuel. Yet even as rage took hold, Lucas could feel that his revenge would mean nothing if it was directed at the wrong man. That conviction separated him from everyone else clamoring for quick conclusions. He began to question not only who killed Marco, but who benefited from Sonny taking the blame, and once that question entered his mind, the entire city started to look different. Port Charles became a maze of false narratives, redirected suspicion, and quiet opportunists using grief as camouflage. Lucas's refusal to believe the obvious made him dangerous to the real players behind the chaos. Unlike those blinded by fear or loyalty, he had nothing left to lose emotionally. That made him fearless in ways he had never been before. He started probing into places others were too intimidated to touch, pushing against stories that had already been accepted as truth. His pain was turning into obsession, and obsession gave him clarity others lacked. But it also risked changing him into someone harsher, less forgiving, more willing to wound in order to expose what had been hidden. Lucas did not just want justice for Marco. He wanted the person responsible to feel hunted, cornered, and stripped bare. He wanted revenge to have intelligence behind it, not just grief, and that made his path more chilling than simple fury. It made it deliberate. At the outer edge of all this chaos, Danny and Charlotte were moving in the shadow of adult crimes, with the desperate urgency of two young people who understood just enough to know that time was running out. They had stumbled into a situation larger than themselves, one tied to the attack on Cullum and the shifting calculations surrounding who would strike next, who already had, and who might be forced into silence before the truth surfaced. Their fear did not look dramatic from the outside. It looked like whispered plans, reckless timing, and the brittle confidence of children trying to carry knowledge too heavy for them. But the danger around them was real, and their choices were beginning to trigger consequences they barely understood. What made the situation worse was that Danny and Charlotte were not simply passive witnesses. They were starting to act. They believed action was necessary, believed that adults had already failed too many times, believed that waiting meant surrendering control to people who had earned none of it. That conviction pushed them toward risky decisions connected to the attack on Cullum, decisions shaped by fear, incomplete information, and a desperate need to protect the people they cared about. Yet, each move they made sent tremors outward, especially toward Valentine. Whether he realized it or not, the children's involvement was drawing a circle around him, placing him in a new sphere of danger where past choices, hidden enemies, and present suspicions were beginning to converge. Valentine had lived too long in the space between manipulation and survival not to recognize the smell of an approaching disaster. The moment he sensed that Danny and Charlotte were entangled in something linked to Cullum, he understood that this was no longer a contained problem. Children complicate every calculation because their fear is unpredictable and their loyalty can make them reckless. If they knew something, if they had seen something, if they were trying to intervene in ways no one anticipated, then the threat against him was no longer theoretical, it was immediate. Suddenly, Valentine was facing the possibility that old secrets and current violence could collide in a way that would leave him exposed from every side. Protection became nearly impossible because every option came with its own ruin. Staying close might draw fire. Keeping distance might leave them vulnerable. Telling the truth might trigger panic. Keeping silent might allow the wrong people to strike first. And that was the true horror spreading across Port Charles. No one was simply reacting anymore. Everyone was calculating, revising, concealing, and striking based on partial truths and private fears. Dante thought pressure would save his son, but it may be the very thing that drives Rocco toward an irreversible mistake. Britt thought control would help her rescue Jason, but the method she is embracing may leave permanent scars on whatever remains of her conscience. Lucas thought grief would break him, yet instead it has transformed him into a relentless force who may uncover truths others would kill to keep buried. Danny and Charlotte think movement is the same as courage, but one wrong step could drag Valentin and everyone around them into catastrophe. By the time the next truth rises to the surface, Port Charles may no longer recognize itself. Fathers will become interrogators. Saviors will begin to resemble conquerors. Mourners will learn how revenge rewrites morality. Children will force open doors that adults spent years trying to keep sealed. And behind every wound, every accusation, every act of desperate love, the same brutal question will remain. When fear takes control, who is still capable of telling the difference between protecting the people they love and destroying them first?